People like to say you're either born to be an entrepreneur or not. I do not agree with that. You either have an entrepreneurial fire in you or you do not, I think is a better way to say it. And by the way, that fire may be here this year. It may not be there 5 years from now, or may be just the opposite. It comes at different times. I think everybody and anybody can catch this entrepreneurial fire. And once it gets in you, you can't deny it.
Welcome to the In Factor, conversations about how great entrepreneurs started, stumbled, and succeeded. I'm Rebecca White, and today's podcast features Allen Clary, entrepreneurship educator and co-founder and director of investor relations at the Tampa Bay WaVE, which is an entrepreneurial hub for tech companies to build, launch, and grow their businesses. In this episode, Allen grants us access to some of the invaluable concepts in his new book, Quit to Start: How to Discover Your Best Idea, Gain the Confidence, and Plan Your Escape. Please enjoy this exciting conversation with Allen Clary. So, Allen, I am so pleased and delighted to have the chance to sit down and talk to you today. As I've told you before, you're one of my favorite people, and I really look forward to every conversation we have because I usually leave feeling inspired and better about the world. So on a day like today, barely a week into the U.S. response to this COVID-19 virus, all of us need some positive inspiration. And I was excited that we were going to get the chance to have this conversation in spite of everything that's going on for everybody. And I was really interested because I saw that you'd written a blog today talking about your new book, Quit to Start: How to Discover Your Best Idea, Gain the Confidence, and Plan Your Escape, which is kind of a risky thing to do in the environment that we're all experiencing right now, where everything's uncertain and everything seems to be pulled out right from under our feet. So I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about the book and maybe, why you wrote a book about quitting and what led you to that, and what your thoughts are today about those people who are sitting out there at a job. They were very close or maybe have already taken that leap, and now all of a sudden their world is turned upside down like the rest of us.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate being on your show. Like I was telling you last week, I binge listened to previous podcasts, and it's an honor to follow a lot of the company that you had on this show. So I'm excited to do it. What an interesting moment. I feel like we're forever going to be bonded now because we're getting to do this show during the middle of this crisis. That's not necessarily a good thing, but we'll forever have this experience. We all remember who we were with and where we were at when certain crises have happened. So we're in the middle of this one. This is a long, protracted situation. I'm in my home, trapped right now with my family, and that's a good situation if you're going to be trapped somewhere and you're at home as well. And we're in the middle of this coronavirus pandemic. So really, that's honestly the least of our concerns. I think I can speak for you. It's the economic impact right now that's unfolding. So, and that's the segue into, entrepreneurship and where we are. We'll get into the Tampa Bay WaVE in a few minutes and all the work I'm doing on the side to help WaVE companies, and which is really relevant. But I did write that blog post this morning on Medium, and the title was called "Did I Write the Wrong Book?" ?
I love that. Self-reflection, right?
Yeah. I just wanted to be honest and try to stimulate, and I wanted to be honest about how I was feeling at the moment. And honestly, I'm not as insecure as that title lends itself. Back up a little bit about the title of the book, Quit to Start. Really, two things, really. First of all, I'm a kind of a bold, audacious person, generally speaking. I don't like to do anything that's going to be soft and weak. So I would never write a book that didn't have a punchy, provocative title. This was my first book. And number two, I wanted to, write something that I thought would tap into the essence of entrepreneurship, which is people that, generally speaking, want to take control of their world, their life, and do big and bold things. And the idea of quitting something to start something is just powerful. I loved that feeling. It came to me, it was like an epiphany. The way this started, I knew I wanted to write a book. Really, you'll appreciate this, Rebecca. It started with students. I teach an entrepreneurship class at University of South Florida. It's a very large class of 50 students, plus or minus. And it's senior level class, undergrads. And so it's kind of a cool catching these 22-year-old-ish students. And I bring a guest speaker every week because, as you know, I've 20 years in the community, Rebecca. You and I both, we know a lot of founders and entrepreneurs. That's why you can have this podcast and I can have that class. And so every week I said, you know what, I'm I'm going to lecture very little. I'm going to try to bring as many real world entrepreneurs into this room as possible, because I don't think you can learn entrepreneurship in a classroom. Much less in a classroom or in a book. The closest you can learn it from doing it yourself is to hear great stories. And storytelling, as we know, is like the number one way to learn anything. And so that's what I've done for the last 4 years. And some of my students say, hey, it's like a TED Talk every week. And I love that. And I go sit down practically cross-legged in the back of the room when I get my speakers up there. I chose to not do it fireside and interview style. I just say, the room is yours. They say, hey, Allen, what do I come and talk about? They're used to pitching their company and telling their company story. I said, I don't want you to do that. I want you to come in and tell your personal story and your personal entrepreneurial journey story. And I want you to especially focus on picking it up as a child, really middle school, high school, wherever, and then walk us through your 20s in a very slow way. I want them to see how the stage was set. And I want these students to especially see that you weren't really special, probably. You probably weren't exceptional. In fact, you probably were the opposite. I want them to relate, not to where your success is today. In fact, don't talk much about it today. Talk about being a young person. So this has been going on for a few years, and my students have just given me, well, there's always a handful of them that always give me a lot of great feedback. And a few of them come back and revisit. And they were pushing me to do something like, they were like, you got to capture this, and podcast, book, what are you doing? And I don't bring recording devices into the room because I want these founders to open up and be intimate and be honest. I've had our founders, guest speakers, get emotional in the room, right? Because sometimes they're telling parts of their story they never told anybody. It's kind of safe to tell a group of kids, if you will. So my students were kind of pressuring me to take it next level. Where's your social media? Where's your podcast? Why aren't you, you're doing this great stuff? And so the book kind of thing became, okay, I think it's a book for me. And first, Rebecca, I was just going to interview 100 entrepreneurs and bake it into a book. And that's where I was headed. In fact, my first interview with Benson Reisman, that is quite special.
Previous guest on our podcast. Yeah. Right. Friend of mine. Yeah.
Benson, it's interesting. Our mutual friend introduced me to Benson. Then I learned that he's a University of Tampa graduate alumni, incredible entrepreneur, and doesn't live in the city, which is also interesting when someone comes in, a bit of a celebrity in my mind. And I got a few minutes with him. And then I was on the hook for this book, but it was really going to be an interview, baked up, kind of benign book, right? Then I was able to do more homework on book writing, and the idea of writing a book that was maybe a little more provocative than that, and it would have a little more of a theme. And actually I had a book coach who I paid a little bit of money to coach me on writing a book and the mistakes that people make with books. And plenty of people can write a book, but can you really get people to really want to read it and create a following for that? And so that's when I did a bit of a pivot with how I approached it. And that's how Quit to Start became the title and the theme. It was a light bulb moment.
I love that. You and I have talked before with some of the students at the University of Tampa who have been trying to figure out, is it time to quit? I'm working on this idea. And I know this book is going to help, and probably already has helped a lot of people kind of figure out what that formula is, because that's a really, really tough thing to do. Yeah. And a really scary thing, even in the best of times. And sometimes life sort of pushes us there. One of the topics in your book, there's a lot of topics and stories of resiliency. And interestingly, this whole podcast came about because of an experience I had with a student who ended up walking out of my class and the entire program when we had a pretty lengthy conversation about failure and the fact that failure is a part of success, and that you're going to have to experience failure along the pathway to success. And it really jolted me. And I started to do some research in that area and saw that, maybe not uncommonly, but a lot of our young people don't have a lot of resilience. And it may be because they haven't built that muscle yet. They haven't had some experiences. We're all getting some experience right now with the times that we're living in. But can you talk a little bit about resilience? Because that's one of the topics I like to focus on in this podcast is, what are some of the struggles and the difficulties that a startup should anticipate if they decide they want to quit? Yep. And how do they prepare for that? How do they build that resiliency muscle?
So I have to start by quoting something from my book. I have a mini chapter called Failure is Overrated. It'd be remiss if I didn't just go with that for a moment. For sure, we talk about failure in this classroom. With all of our speakers, it's a quite circulated topic in entrepreneurship and how it's a necessary path to getting to where you need to go. In fact, I had a venture capitalist speak to my class last year. He's a very good friend of mine out of Seattle. And he said they will not invest in a company that the founder has not had at least one major failure. yet. And he was dead serious about that. It was a policy. So it's real that failure and stumbling and struggling. And I liked what Nick Freeman said on his previous podcast with you. He talked about micro failures versus catastrophic failures, right? I thought that was great because I think none of us really want catastrophic failures. And in fact, that's something that, should be avoided at all costs, but definitely stumbles and micro failures, even ones that hurt, are important, and they failing forward, I think, are important. But I say failure is overrated. I got that chapter because I like to clarify that, that said, every founder I know, or myself and the ones I've been around, and anyone I've ever seen be successful in any interviews I've conducted or interviews I've read, et cetera, they all had a massive fear of failure in the drive and lead up to what they were accomplishing. So it's this interesting, constructive, creative tension between knowing that failures can be okay, but it's really painful and you want to avoid it, but also knowing that you cannot fail. I cannot fail. Failure is not an option. I must do everything possible for this to not fail. So it's just a really interesting thing to have two things in your mind. And frankly, I would coach founder and entrepreneurs to not have that in their mind as I were coaching one on the way up. Now, once they did fail or stumble, then I could use that information to help them kind of feel better, dust themselves off and get back in it. But I wouldn't even want that to be a factor, be like any other competition in life. So I know you probably end up clarifying that at some point, but I think it's something I like to talk about in the book. And I like to call it a massive fear of failure. In fact, I see it, Rebecca, in all the studies and research and interviews I did for the book. And even with myself, like a massive fear of failure is something that all successful entrepreneurs kind of have. And in fact, I would argue that it might be the single most powerful source of energy and success that all successful entrepreneurs have. I know I don't mean to be counter, because I do agree, of course, but at the same time, I think this is really, really important, this element of massive fear of failure. And then if you do struggle and fail, then how you cope with it is with the thinking that you've just laid out. Then you can say, okay, wait a minute. What did I learn? Let me pick myself up. Let me get back in the game. I'm not dead. And then you got to hear, okay, this was part of the process. Let me get back in. Very similar to a sporting analogy, right? Nobody ever tries to throw an interception. And so the job of the coach is to say, hey, guess what? This is going to happen. But you're never going out there thinking you're going to throw an interception. That should be the furthest thing from your mind. You should be thinking about nothing but visualizing, connecting with your receiver and connecting with the score. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. And do you think it's how we define failure? Because, I think it was Sarah Blakely said, that she learned early on that failure was about not trying and not experimenting. And in some ways, I kind of see that that's what we're talking about here. There's the fear of failure, meaning stopping, getting to the point where we're done, versus the fear of an outcome that's an unexpected outcome. I hear what you're saying. It's really interesting. The massive, failure is not an option, I think, versus understanding that failure is part of that success process. It's a great conversation and a great juxtaposition.
It works together. To add to what you said, maybe the way I would kind of build on that is to say, same with I don't like to get into too many sports analogies, but the same thing is that you can't be so afraid of failure that you're not executing, or you can't be so afraid of failure that you're tight and you're not making good, clear decisions, and you're playing it too safe and conservative, and you're not thinking creatively and openly. You're not taking chances. You're being afraid. You're afraid. So that's ultimately, I think, what the essence of what you're saying and what Sarah is talking about. You have to be willing to take risks, take the chance. Oh, if this doesn't work, we're going to try something else. If that doesn't work, we're going to do something else. And it's kind of like back to micro failures, like making stumbles along the way. You want your ultimate strategy to be as correct as possible. You want to make those mistakes as least expensive and least painful as possible. Even those are recoverable. So I think that's the best way I would say about it, is that it's got to be a fear of failure combined with the willingness to take chances and to experiment and do things. Someone more articulate than me can really define that better. I think I need to go work on that, because I think it's so important that those two things coexist in the same concept.
Yeah, it gives me a lot to think about too. And as much as I experience it, in my own life, with the people I work with the students, I think it's still something we can spend a lot more time on. Very important though, very critical. One of the things that I talk with students a lot about is building up some sort of a network, some sort of a plan for how they can cope when they do have outcomes that they don't want. And I think sometimes just knowing that they're coming and having something in place can really help mitigate some of that fear that
Yes.
goes along with it.
Yes. Could I add to that
Yeah,
really
sure.
quick? Because I think that actually ties into a previous question you said about, or maybe where you're going with this, is that, what would be the number one thing that a founder or an entrepreneur, an aspiring entrepreneur would want to have around them before they venture out into whatever they're going to pursue? And that is exactly what you said is, the resources that you put around you, the people that you put around you, both in your team and outside of your team, and all around you, and even the amount of money that you can scrape together, and all of the angles that you work into your business and your venture. Ultimately, you and I both know, even though you're putting those together for success, ultimately, if and when you do stumble large or small, it's those people, all those stakeholders around you that you've been able to collect. Those are the people that actually are your support group for when that happens.
Right.
And if you don't have those people and resources around you building what you're building along the way, then when you do stumble and fail, you don't easily get back up, because we need people and resources to get back up and go and get back in the game.
Right. Now, you talk in your book, as we said, it's about when to quit. And you mentioned that it's not about quitting badly, abruptly, too soon. You're not encouraging everybody to they pick up your book and read it, and the next day they just walk in without that safety net that we just talked about. Mm-hmm. But you developed a model that you call the quit zone. Would you unpack that idea and tell us a little bit more about when's the best time to quit?
Yeah, so that's the big question, right? In all disclosure, I use the quit hook in the book cover, the title. It's as a hook, is to really get people's attention, only so I can tell them not to quit immediately, right? So that it's like, because I know everybody kind of loves the idea of the quit and would love to, but ultimately the ultimate idea in the book immediately says, okay, we know that's where you want to go and you want to make your big move, but you need to have a lot of things in place to do that correctly. So many things, including timing. You said when, right? But way before the when, all the things you have to put in place. First of all, the little diagram that I created called the quit zone talks about, well, first of all, capability has to meet opportunity, right? If you just are frustrated, it's not enough. I mean, we all get frustrated, and that's a lot of the emotional tap-in that we're talking about with, wanting to quit a job to do something. But you ultimately, to be successful, you need to be able to intersect capability with opportunity. So there's plenty of people that have plenty of capability. They have programming skills, or they have food preparation, delivery, skills. They have organizational skills. They've even had marketable skills, marketing. All the job that they do in their paid job is skill that they theoretically could take out into the market, and free market is independently. So that capability is there. But opportunity, if they don't have the opportunity, you can't go. Opportunity, what does opportunity mean? Opportunity means, hey, do you have enough savings saved up in your bank account? That ties in with opportunity. Do you have a starting client? And I wouldn't put those in the necessary order. I would actually start with, the order would be a starting client or a customer would be the first thing you would want to have as an opportunity. If someone's ready and willing to pay for your capability and your service, right? So, and like I said, it is opportunity. It talks about money, whether it's your own money or investor money, customers, client. The opportunity has to do with conditions. Look at what we're dealing with the economy right now. The conditions have to be right for that opportunity to be there to meet your capability. But then that's not enough. You need to have some fuel. And that's the other piece of the diagram. I say that the quit zone is when capability meets opportunity, fueled by frustration or a big idea, right? So let's talk about the fuel, right? So if you've got capability and opportunity come together and you feel like that's happened, that moment is upon you, then typically that's not enough to make people jump, because if your frustration level isn't where it normally would be to take the leap, or if you're not pursuing a big enough idea, then you can't quite intersect those things enough to make the leap and make it work, right? So those things have to all come together.
I love that because you're right. I think sometimes it is a matter of frustration that takes you out the door, and other times it's a matter of moving toward something. And if you don't have one of those, you're probably not going to have the motivation to move. So you talked in your book also about success being where preparation and opportunity meet. That's kind of like the capabilities and opportunity that you're talking about. And you talk about the importance of preparing to start your venture, and you liken it to a wilderness hike or flying an airplane. Tell us about that analogy.
Yeah. And I like to say a multi-week wilderness hike.
A multi-week. Okay. Not just overnight.
Yeah. Like in other words, wilderness hike, for the day, that's not a problem. The spectrum starts when it comes to startup world, the spectrum starts with a multi-week wilderness hike. that includes, the tents and the food and the trail planning and who you're taking with you and the risks and the bobcats and the physical terrain and the weather and all the things that would go, have you done it before? Who's done it before? We're going to be out there for 3 weeks. You can just imagine the amount of preparation and risk that would take, to be successful at that, or even have the boldness to do it. And so that's kind of on the low end of the startup risk effort, preparation spectrum. And by the way, preparation, I'm glad you used that word, because everything about that multi-week hike would be about preparation, right? I mean, all the things I listed, including experience, having done some smaller versions of it yourself, right? Having done a 1 day overnight or 2 or 3 day or whatever leading up to a multi-week. And then there are no startups that are less difficult than that and require less preparation than that, really. That's a good way to think about it. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I talk about wheels up, or like flying an airplane. Now, I like to talk especially about the first time that you solo pilot and get that plane off the ground, the very first time, right? The preparation that it took for you to be solo piloting the wheels up is a good bit higher than that multi-week wilderness hike. Because that multi-week wilderness hike, yeah, sure, you might get injured yourself. Yeah, you could die. A lot of bad things could go wrong, but chances are you could power through about anything in a 3-week wilderness situation, right? With the right amount of preparation. But piloting an airplane without the proper preparation and training, you will die. I mean, it will not work. There are things that are physically true and universally true. And you put me, who has no experience flying an airplane and no training preparation, you put me in a plane right now today, put me in there and say, here's the 5 buttons you need, and give me a 5-minute tutorial and say you're on your own and you've got no choice. But that is not going to be a good outcome. So that's the little spectrum that I like to play with.
I love that analogy, actually, and it's a great analogy, I think, because we don't always think about starting a business that way. And so many people go out and just, they take the leap just because, they start a restaurant just because they've eaten at one before, just because you've been a passenger in an airplane doesn't mean that you have the capability to fly an airplane.
Right.
So,
and then wow.
Yeah, so it's a great example, I think.
Yes. And the gauges, just learning the gauges and how to handle those and understanding the feedback that you need to be successful, even once you have that plane in the air, is so important.
So, a lot of the listeners to this podcast are students, and I get questions from students a lot of times about, should I start my company now or should I go work for somebody else? So if I'm hearing you correctly, I think you would probably advise them to at least get some work experience, if possible, in the industry space that they're considering. Is that true?
I would. That is true. Absolutely. But here's the way I would put the exception out there. And I don't know if I can do this as scientifically as I would like, but I talk about in my book, the thing about entrepreneurship really, I think that fundamentally equates to success, of course, with capability and opportunity and the things we talked about, boils down to something called how bad do you want it, right? And is it completely consuming you, right? And I apologize for using such flowery language, but is this ticking and ticking and ticking against you every day, all the time? And is this something that you just have to do and it never stops calling? And I know this is true for so many entrepreneurs, especially ones that cross over and make it, like we talked about, that fear of failure and that drive. So if I saw a young person that was in college, even before college, Rebecca, honestly, that just had the wherewithal, now they couldn't just have that. They've got to already be demonstrating some ability in the market. They're already hustling something already, or they're already working on something, and they're already experimenting with something. They're already trying things. They're pulling people together. They're just doing it. These people do exist. These students, pre and post during college, and they is just who they are. And those exceptional people say that they probably should continue to just go and pursue that. Right. I think that you only get one shot sometimes at these things. And if you have that kind of momentum and that mindset and it is just overwhelming, here's another reason I say to do it, because that's what you should be doing. And everybody knows you should be doing that. Number two, you would probably be miserable and do poorly in class anyway, in school. Right. So, follow that. But that's such a 1%er, Rebecca. So what you're referring to right now, who you were referring to earlier, is the other 30% of people that are really smart, that want to be entrepreneurs, that are dabbling a little bit or even studying it or thinking about it, love talking about it, love being around it, following it, even maybe doing some experimenting, maybe doing all of those great things, probably not enough to overcome the importance of go ahead and A, getting your education, and B, getting into a job and getting that experience so that you can find a real world problem. We know that also clearly from entrepreneurship, no problem, no business. You've got to find a real problem. And you've also got to go out and find out what it's like to work with other people and get some experience, see things, get some bumps and scrapes on other people's dime, if you will, and wait for your time and wait for that intersection, right? So it's like a 1% situation, but for most, absolutely go, get into the world, spend a few years in a job and then find again. And by the way, you shouldn't be thinking, I'm going to get a few years so I can be an entrepreneur. I think that's the wrong kind of thinking. You should say, hey, I'm going to go get into the forest, which is the job, and I'm going to wait for something to appear. Because ultimately, a lot of this stuff, it comes to you. Like you can't manufacture, obviously you can, but arguably the best stuff is going to come to you. The right people are going to enter your life at the right time, the right idea, the right problem. If you force that stuff, you're likely to burn a lot of resources and bullets on something when you should have waited for the right things to intersect. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, it feels like to me, if you're asking yourself that question, then it means you should get the experience because those 1%ers that you're talking about, they're not asking themselves that question. And
Correct.
If you're asking yourself that question, you probably still have more to learn. And I've seen that with a number of my students who really wanted this lifestyle of an entrepreneur, but they had not yet had their experience. And, I can think of a couple right off the top of my head where it's very obvious. They went out and they had either in one case, a life experience, in another case, a couple of years in an industry, and they were able to identify a really big opportunity. But they had to have that experience. So if you're asking yourself that question, I think it almost means, you still have more to learn. And probably you need to get out there and experience that. Many entrepreneurs experience what you call the solo entrepreneur trap, trying to do everything themselves, which eventually leads to burnout and doubts, and which I think you talk about experiencing a couple of times yourself. And you highlight the importance of a team. When is the best time to develop a team? Is it before you quit, from the start, once you realized you need it, somewhere in between? Is there a rule for that?
Oh, thank you for asking that. This is one of my favorite topics, and it ended up towards the end of my book, unfortunately. It's interesting when you write a book, some of the stuff you want to talk about sometimes can end up in the wrong place. And this was towards the end, and this is the one I love talking about the most, because not only did I experience it myself, but unfortunately I've witnessed firsthand so many of my friends fall into this situation. There's different levels, not just the solopreneur trap and dilemma, which I'll get into, but also even when they started building a small team, still continue to struggle with the following issues. So the first part is the solopreneur dilemma, right? And the dilemma really goes like this, where when you are breaking out as a solopreneur, anything from a marketing professional to a photographer to an event planner to a programmer to, any skill set that you might have, you might start, in that way, consultant, advisor, coach, whatever. Ultimately, you love doing the craft of it, right? That's why you're doing it. You love doing the craft and you're really good. You're really, really good at it. That's why you're able to be a solopreneur. People pay you well for that. And you really take a lot of pride in every detail of it, right? And so that's what got you there, right? But unfortunately, as you start doing well, more and more business, you struggle to keep up. But then you enter these up and down cycles of new project, next project, last project. And when you're doing a project, this is mostly project-based work. When you're a solopreneur, you can't work on finding your next one. So you end up in these valleys and peaks and valleys. And so you have times where you go too busy for a few months, and then you could go a few months and barely have enough project work. And it's really maddening and it's really tough on your finances. But it's the dilemma of, do I spend time developing new business or do I spend time delivering on my existing business? And almost every solopreneur I've ever known always goes to the delivering, right? Because they're just really, that's what they're good at. Nobody likes to sell. Nobody likes to market. Nobody likes to network. And no solopreneur I've ever met likes to do that. So that's the dilemma. And then, but if you do break out of that, which I've seen, and ultimately you end up in a trap that way, right? A trap meaning that if you end up just always going to, you're doing this and not growing the business, you ultimately end up trapped, and that becomes your new normal where you're doing everything all the time and years can clip off and you're exhausted and, you don't have a lot of value to show for it. You can't sell your company because it's all dependent upon you. You can't even get vacations anymore. A few years down the road, it is a trap that you can find yourself just because you were so prideful and so about the work. And by the way, your clients love that about you. They are never going to stop you from being in the trap. They want you to stay in the trap, right? But then I watch companies grow from there. Sometimes they get some enlightened founders actually get wiser than that, and they start even creating teams, small teams to help. But then I watch them struggle with that as well, where they don't actually grow the team to run without them. Oh my goodness. So they build a team only to support, to say, hey, I need more help. You've heard the term, I don't have enough help, can't get enough good help, which is just
Right.
the wrong
Right.
language. But it's the wrong language. But ultimately, they're just looking, and this makes sense. That solopreneur I was describing is looking for more help. But ultimately, they should be thinking at some point, if they ever want to have wealth and freedom, and I talk about in this book, is wealth and freedom are the two things that you should have at the end of this run in 20 years, right? You should have wealth and freedom. Then you actually have to build a team that can work and run without you. And
Right.
you have to run without you. And that's so hard for people to get their head around. Even I struggle with it. It's so hard to get your head around that. And I watch people, and we can name some names locally that have done it. And now they've gotten their wealth and freedom, but that's how they did it, right? And then there's that little step in the middle that says the first step to that, building a team, is to give up the delivery, but keep the sales and marketing yourself. As the founder and the CEO, if you will, you're still the face, the energy, and only you can go out and win projects and close deals, because the client wants you. And you got to get used to this idea of going out and winning the deals and then letting someone else deliver and lightly managing. That's, first of all, that is almost impossibly hard for so many solopreneurs to even make that step. But if they do that, they're halfway there, because then they can start smelling and tasting the victory. Because then they're going, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually detached from the delivery. Then over the next several years, the next big step is, can I get someone else to sell and market and close deals? Now you're on the 1-inch yard line to wealth and freedom.
You know, Allen, I'm listening to you talk, and I love where you're headed with this. And it sounds like to me it ought to be your next book. Maybe you need to be.
That's what I said. I put it at the end, and I was like, this is what I want to really write about. And somehow it ended at the end. But yes, I love this topic.
Your next book, there's quit to start, and then there's whatever the next stage is. After you started, what do you do now? So right. Especially, in solo entrepreneurs, you're right. It's a completely different game, really, than starting a bigger company right from the start. And, I can remember students. I had a student who was a great photographer, and she wanted to start her own photography business. And when she did the financials and she realized how much of her time was not going to be spent actually bringing in money, she realized how hard it was going to be to make it go as a solo entrepreneur, because she had to, taking the photographs was what she loved, but there was so much, there was selling and there was developing and all the other billing and all the other parts that go along with that. You've advised a lot of entrepreneurs over the years, and you've been an entrepreneur. And I think one of the people that really influenced this book was your father. I think we talked about this not long ago in a different conversation that we had. He took a leap from employment to entrepreneurship and had an incredible impact on the development of your own entrepreneurial mindset. And I love that. I'm really curious about some of the essential success principles you learned from his journey, and maybe you might share a few of those with us.
No, I appreciate it, Rebecca. I appreciate you asking. It's often difficult for me to talk about because I lost my father a year and a half ago, really early. He was only 18 when I was born. Yeah, he was only 18 when I was born, and so he was not an old man. He was actually running his multi-million-dollar business with full head of steam when he was struck by a cancer that he fought for several years and wasn't able to win. And so when I think about my father, about entrepreneurship, really, it was just kind of, he was a self-made man. I thought he graduated high school. I learned recently he might have walked and didn't get the diploma. I don't know. There's some controversy I just heard recently, but he is, high school graduate and basically self-made person with a multi-million-dollar business that he had to quit to start. I think without getting into that, that story, that was a pretty epic story about how he did that without any money, basically at the poverty line with our family, and then what he did from there. But your question was more about the influence and impact he had with me. And it was just this ridiculous tenacity and determination. And it was unhealthy almost, Rebecca, really. Like so many first generation wealth builders, let's be honest, so many first generation wealth builders that have to pull themselves up from poverty or no education. It's just, they come up the trades. Like my father didn't have an engineering degree, but he worked in a quasi-engineering kind of industry, right, in the construction worlds and surveying and mapping. And so, but he just became a machine of a person in terms of work ethic. And he just, obviously first in, last out. And he worked ridiculously amount of time per week for years and years and years. And then with me, and I mentioned this in another interview, he wanted to make me kind of unbreakable, right? Because I was raised a bit on a little bit of a ranch in the country. And so I was raised kind of country strong or country tough, as you will. And my dad, but he took it to another level. It was some pretty brutal Southern raising, right? I grew up basically in South Georgia. And so, and at times, as a kid, you don't understand why your father is being so hard on you, because ultimately he's just trying to make you tough enough to face the world so that, and I've said before, he would break me so that others couldn't, so the world couldn't, right? So, and he did successfully in that. And I've carried that as a badge of honor forever. Like, I know that I'm unbreakable. I cannot be broken because of that. It's impossible. So that was what he put in me, and I just watched him do it. And then I watched him lead people. He was such a strong leader, and he was just unbreakable himself. He just really put that in me, and he put even our relationship at risk at times to make sure that would be in me, right? So that was the greatest gift he could have given me. And then I've just used that on and on. And honestly, the only thing I would say to that too is I got to grow up underneath a first-generation entrepreneur that did it the hard way. And so, if I could segue a little bit, I know that I'm a better coach than I am an entrepreneur. Honestly, I've had several entrepreneurial ventures. I've had some that were pretty impressive, but I don't feel like I wasn't able to pull off the hockey stick success of my father, right? But what I do have is I have the ability to put forward what my father put in me to other people. I know I'm a better coach than I'm an entrepreneur. So I know how to get the most out of people. I know how to pull it out of them. I don't necessarily say inspire them, because it's got to be within you, but I know how to see it in you. I know how to pull it out of you. And how to trigger it in you, because my dad knew how to do that with me and other people. And also, I was able to study an entrepreneur, not just him, but I went on to work. I like to say I was the best number 2 guy in the business. I went on to work. I was attracted to be the number 2 guy with multiple entrepreneurs over my career, because I understood them. Without getting into another podcast, I'm like the CEO whisperer, I used to say.
Right.
Like, that was my role. I was that guy because I knew the animal. It was my father. And I knew the people, the rank and file, because that was probably more me. But I knew the CEO founder, and to this day, I still have that. So I'm able to translate. I'm like the translator, if you will, but I also know how to I can see right into them and see why they're so narcissistic or why they're so emotional and why they react just on and on and on. And that was just my dad. I learned it from just watching my dad. My dad was not a balanced, well-spoken entrepreneur. He could never do this interview like this, right? He just knew how to do it. He just knew how to do it. And I know you see this plenty, right? So that was my thing, was I just got to be a student of that. And then I got to watch a lot of other people do it up close. And then that's why I think I'm able to be a pretty good, coach and speaker, and some, and hopefully my class benefits from that.
That's a great story. And I had no idea how much we had in common, because I have an entrepreneurial mom who I lost about a year and a half ago too, who I learned at her feet as well. And there's lots of research that demonstrates that role models have a big influence on entrepreneurship.
You get a little Southern thing in common too, I think.
Yeah, you can hear that in my accent a little bit, right?
Me too. I think I might be more Southern than you, Rebecca.
Yeah, well, I grew up in West Virginia, which is, is kind of mid-Atlantic, but still I have a bit of that Southern accent, Southern style. You mentioned coaching, and you are teaching a course, as you said, at the University of South Tampa, and you've done that for a while, and
South Florida.
Advised a lot of entrepreneurs in a lot of places, including in our Lowe Center at the University of Tampa. And we love you for that. Thank you. I
have to jump in really quick and say something, because I made it in my notes prior to this call. I mentioned my students at USF, pushed me for this book, but I'm not going to say who, but there was a student, there's at least 2 to 3 students at the UT program that I had a chance to work with personally in the lead up to this over the last couple of years. I wish I could just say their names. I just don't want to be doing that. That they also not only pushed me to do this book, but more importantly, there was this, like all the students, but especially the ones I worked with one-on-one, like I did with several of these UT students in the entrepreneurship program, your program, that it was like, how would I say it? And I get this feeling from a lot of students. It was like that they just expected this from me, like just expected it from me. So I felt like when I was going through the hard days and months of trying to write this thing and get it out the door, not letting them down was like a big driver. Back to that fear of failure, Rebecca. Honestly, this book had that, right? Not letting
and the why. You had a why.
Honestly, I have more one-on-one relationship with the UT entrepreneurship students than I did with the USF students. The USF students were, big classroom and occasional some one-on-one stuff that was happening, good stuff there. But my one-on-one entrepreneur resident stuff in your program is a little more personal, honestly. So anyway, I just wanted to say that this book really, I had to push this book out, because there was no way I was letting down these young people. There's no way I could do it.
Yeah, I love that. I appreciate that. And we thank you for the work that you do with them and with all the students. The people that you've worked with, some of them further along the path than students, you've worked with a lot of them. Is there anything that you could say differentiates the successful ones from the unsuccessful ones? A few things, a few traits, or a few behaviors, perhaps?
Yeah. I always kind of go, and you can tell from this conversation, I kind of go to the superlative place, the fire and the will. It's kind of this thing that it's really hard to describe. People like to say you're either born to be an entrepreneur or not. I do not agree with that. You either have an entrepreneurial fire in you or you do not, I think is a better way to say it. And by the way, that fire may be here this year. It may not be there 5 years from now, or may be just the opposite. It comes at different times. I think everybody and anybody can catch this entrepreneurial fire. And once it gets in you, you can't deny it. You have to exercise it, right? So that's the one thing, even with students, put aside academics and everything in life and their background. It's like, you can tell, and I have one of your students in mind right now, and she is unstoppable. There's nothing going to stop this young lady. And it's unbelievable. I actually can't wait to go sit with her because I feel like I'm better off after, because I'm like, this person is not going to stop. They're not even looking for me for coaching. They're just wanting to talk about what they're going to do anyway. And I get to listen and act like I'm helping them. This is for real. So that's it. It's simple. In the book, I say, how bad do you want it? And you got to have it if you got to have it. And ultimately, I just feel like my experience and all the ones that I've interviewed and know about and read about and study and adore, and the famous ones and non-famous ones, that just always was the common thread.
I love it. I love it. Well, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I could sit and talk even longer, but I do want to bring this to a closure with a question that I ask everybody on my podcast. If there's one piece of advice that you could give to our listeners, what would it be?
It would be right along the lines of what we've talked about. Don't force entrepreneurship. Do not force it. Wait for it and let the conditions become right. This whole idea of kind of making entrepreneurship happen is not a thing. So you can study all, I don't care if you're talking about who you're talking about, Henry Ford or Elon Musk. You can pick any of them. They were all, timing was very important, not just market timing, but also their personal timing, right? So that's the biggest thing I would say. Be patient. It might be 2-3 years from now, 5 years from now, even 10 years from now. And don't become too obsessed with trying to make that happen. So that would be the biggest advice that I would put out there.
I love that. I love that. Allen, where can our listeners find your book and how can they connect with you?
So it's quittostart.com is the book. And I've also launched planyourstart.com. They both work together, Plan Your Start and Quit to Start. Quit to Start obviously is the book. Plan Your Start I came up with because I said, you know what, this title is so provocative. I need to make a safer place for people to go. Honestly. So I've got Plan Your Start. So I'm kind of having fun playing with these two brands, but I'm personally on LinkedIn, of course, and also Facebook and Instagram, all the social platforms. My Twitter is a little behind, but that's going to be going soon. But really on the social media, all platforms, and quittostart.com is a good place to start.
Allen Clary, author of Quit to Start, How to Discover Your Best Idea, Gain the Confidence, and Plan Your Escape. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure.